Hello, folks. Tonight, we'll dive deep into the city of Pompeii, which wasn't a paradise, but a hell awaiting its end. That city you imagine from books as a model of Roman prosperity, full of marble and art, brimming with life. But while Hollywood portrays it as a perfect city, the truth is that life in Pompeii was miserable, full of sickness and injustice. And it ended in a tragedy that wasn't as sudden as you might think. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm presenting here. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe light a candle to create a calm atmosphere, and let's begin our journey together tonight. Let's be clear. No one in the Roman era dreamed of living in Pompeii. Instead, they were born there because they had no choice. To be a resident of Pompeii wasn't a choice. It was a destiny. Most of the city's inhabitants weren't nobles or the wealthy, but desperate farmers, exhausted slaves, or poor artisans crowded into narrow shacks, far from the luxurious villas portrayed in movies. To understand Pompeii, you must first understand the empire that gave birth to it. You might hear about the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, that period filled with stability and prosperity. But this peace was brutal and artificial. It was imposed by military force and bought with the blood of the peoples Rome conquered. This empire, which seemed like a symbol of progress, was in fact a savage machine of power, built on wars and conquests and on the shoulders of millions of slaves. Its social pyramid was cruel, and it ensured that the wealthy would remain wealthy, while the poor and slaves would live at the bottom of society. At the top were the wealthy nobles, who owned vast lands and lavish villas. Their lives were a continuous feast and a relentless exploitation of cheap labor. They lived in a completely separate world, a world of marble and hanging gardens. At the bottom were the common people and the poor, who lived in crowded residential buildings called insulae. These buildings were ticking time bombs, liable to collapse and catch fire at any moment. Their residents suffered from malnutrition and competed for meager government food rations. Their lives were a constant struggle for survival, where diseases were rampant and opportunities were non-existent. At the very bottom of the pyramid were the slaves. They weren't just servants, they were property. They were bought and sold and used for everything, from hard labor in the fields and mines to household service. They had no rights. They were just tools, subject to flogging and torture for the slightest mistake. Their lives were a constant fear, without any hope for freedom or dignity. Pompeii wasn't a paradise, but merely a mirror of all the flaws of this empire. It had its luxurious villas for the nobles, its filthy alleys for the poor, and its cheap eateries for the laborers, all of which reflected a cruel class system, where death sometimes seemed like a salvation from a life full of misery. Now that you understand the big picture, let's dive into the filthy details of daily life in Pompeii. The truth is that its streets were not clean. There were no modern sewage systems. The sewers were open, and garbage was piled up in back alleys. Imagine waking up every morning to a foul smell that you couldn't escape. And let's talk about the most brutal places in the city, the public latrines. There was no privacy. They were just stone seats lined up in a single room. And what's worse, there was no toilet paper. Instead, a shared sponge attached to a stick was used, which was washed in a basin of salt water or vinegar and shared with others. And if you thought sickness was bad, wait until you hear about the treatment. Roman medicine wasn't a scientific leap, but a matter of trial and error. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, with simple tools like saws and iron pincers. Imagine undergoing an amputation while doctors hold you down and you can feel every movement. The medicines were no more than superstitions mixed with herbs. You might be given animal blood or some poisonous plants in the hope they'd heal you, only to discover later that you now suffer from two diseases. Let's talk about food. If you imagine every day was a feast, you're completely wrong. Most residents relied on a monotonous diet of dark bread and grain porridge. Meat was a rare luxury. The eateries, or thermopolia, were just holes in the walls selling cheap meals, often contaminated. And the biggest disaster? Many Roman pots and cooking utensils were made of lead, which caused many to suffer from chronic lead poisoning, which led to madness and a slow death. Not everyone was equal in Pompeii. The rich lived a life of luxury. They owned slaves and ate the finest foods. As for the poor, they were crowded into tight rooms and worked non-stop to please their masters. Slavery was not an exception, but the rule. Slaves were not just servants, they were property. And they were treated without any mercy, sleeping in stables with animals and being flogged for the slightest mistake. Then came the entertainment, which was cruel and savage. Gladiators didn't fight for honor, but for a better life or simply not to die in the arena. The crowd screamed and laughed and enjoyed watching men fight to the death, with blood covering the ground. Let's talk about love and family. Marriage was often a financial or social transaction. Women had few rights and were considered the property of men. And the children? Infant mortality was common, and the children who survived were treated harshly. Childhood wasn't a happy period as we imagine it, but just a stage to reach labor and responsibility. In all this misery, there was a silent gloom that dominated the city. The burdens weren't just physical, but psychological as well. You were stuck in your social status with no hope of advancement. And in all this hell, people didn't turn to faith for comfort, but for fear. Romans believed that any natural disaster or illness was due to the wrath of the gods. This created a state of constant anxiety and psychological pressure. The fear of angering the gods, especially Vulcan, the god of fire and volcanoes, was an integral part of their daily lives. And the most terrifying thing was the volcano itself. Vesuvius wasn't a secret. It had been intermittently puffing smoke before the big eruption, and minor earthquakes were common. The residents of Pompeii lived in a state of constant fear of an impending disaster. The fact that many people overlook is that Pompeii didn't suddenly fall to the mercy of the volcano. The city received a clear warning 17 years before the catastrophe. In the year 62 AD, a massive earthquake struck the area and caused widespread destruction in Pompeii. But the Romans, instead of understanding this sign as a geological warning, believed it was just a passing fit of divine rage. They ignored the warning and began rebuilding the city. They didn't realize that their true fear wasn't of death, but of life itself, and that the death looming on the horizon would in fact be a salvation from all this misery. Everyone thinks the people of Pompeii were frozen in place in an instant by volcanic ash. This is the most famous myth. But the truth is much more horrifying. Death was not instantaneous. On the morning of August 24, 79 AD, life in Pompeii was proceeding as usual. But at around 1 p.m., everything changed. Mount Vesuvius erupted and launched a massive column of smoke, ash, and volcanic rock into the sky. Then the reign of death began. Not ordinary volcanic rock, but pumice. It fell in enormous abundance and accumulated quickly. It trapped people in their homes and caused roofs to collapse from the weight. This rain was not fast, but it was slow and agonizing. But the real horror didn't come until after midnight. At the peak of the eruption, the volcano released what are called pyroclastic surges, huge clouds of toxic gases, ash, and glowing rocks. These surges were not slow, but moved at an incredible speed, reaching hundreds of kilometers per hour. When these surges hit Pompeii, death was not from suffocation. Their temperature exceeded 300 degrees Celsius. This meant that death was instantaneous. The victims' soft tissues were vaporized in a flash, leaving only skeletons behind. This is the real reason behind the shapes we see today in the plaster casts. They are not of people who were asleep, but of people who were in the most extreme moments of terror, screaming and in agony before being instantly incinerated. It was not a poetic end, but a cruel and terrifying one. Let's assume you were lucky, that you were faster than the ash and smarter than the guards. You survived. But was that the end of the story? Was it the beginning of a better new life? Unfortunately, it was just the beginning of another hell. The escape was no picnic. It was a journey from hell, through darkness and ash, amidst terror and screaming. They had to leave everything behind, their money, their possessions, their identity. They became refugees overnight. And when they arrived in neighboring cities, they weren't welcomed as heroes. Quite the opposite. Roman society, which strongly believed in the gods and their wrath, looked upon them as cursed. They were treated as people who brought the gods' wrath upon themselves and their city. They lost everything: family, friends, homes, and even their identity. This loss ultimately led them to a life of poverty and begging. They survived physical death, but lived a life of isolation and despair. This psychological pain was more severe than death itself. After you've learned all these facts, after you've seen how life in Pompeii was composed of layers of misery, you must ask yourself, was the Vesuvius disaster just a disaster? Or was it a salvation from a life full of misery, injustice, and pain? Was that final moment, the moment the lethal pyroclastic surge arrived, an end to a tragedy or a beginning of relief? For many who lived their entire lives in poverty and fear, perhaps instant death was more merciful than continuing that suffering. The story Pompeii tells us today is not the story of buried beauty, but the story of a horror that never left. It's the story of a city that was slowly dying before the volcano ended its life. Perhaps on that fateful day, death was the only escape available. Share your opinion in the comments. And if you are interested in knowing more dark truths that are untold in books, subscribe to the channel, and let's enter together on a journey into the depths of history.